severely underestimated the debate on how Jane Seymour is perceived by history fans. There's a greater divide between her lovers and haters than there are for Anne Boleyn, it seems, and her on-screen counterparts don't seem to help reconcile them. You'd think there wouldn't be as many interpretations of Jane Seymour as the past two wives, and that's where you're wrong. Unfortunately, because the majority of Tudor dramas about Henry VIII cover that decade he lusted after, married and murdered Anne Boleyn, the other four wives only tend to appear on screen when the drama covers all six wives, with a brief exception of Catherine Parr. For Jane Seymour, she ranges from cameo to plot device to cliff note summary to actual friggin' character. And we're here today to look at their different interpretations. These are the Jane Seymours that don't really have much of a contribution on the plot or leave much of an impact. Their only purpose in the plot is to pay lip service to history and have someone Henry can replace Anne Boleyn with. They're not too remarkable, but they play a Jane Seymour, so they might as well be included. We've got Leslie Patterson from Anne of the Thousand Days. She only appears in one scene in the film, although she is referenced off screen quite a bit. The scene is a parallel with one towards the beginning, where once it was Catherine storming out of the ball because Henry was eyeing a young woman. Henry is doing the same thing again and Anne is the one storming out. Now that's some good parallels. It's odd that this version of Jane has brown hair, given one of the few things we know about her is that she had fair hair. But on the other hand, it's very light brown, so it's something I can forgive. Then we've got Naomi Benson from The Other Boleyn Girl 2003. And here I can't forgive the hair colour, because the movie actually has to tell you that this is Jane Seymour and you wouldn't realise straight away because this Jane Seymour has pretty dark brown hair and Jane Seymour was blonde dum-dums. All you had to do was cover her head with a gabled hood and this wouldn't be an issue because gabled hoods were designed to cover the hair. She doesn't do much in this. There is a brief thing where she's talking to Henry while sat on his lap and Anne watches from behind a tapestry and she doesn't dramatically storm in like the Tudors or, you know, give her a smack like in the 2021 version. That probably would have been a prime time for Jodie to come in and be like, everybody betrayed me, I'm fed up with this world. That's me trying to do a Tommy Wiseau impersonation. You're tearing me apart, Henry! Oh, it's just another sin to add to the eventual Cinema Sins parody. And then we've got Corinne Galloway from the 2008 Other Boleyn Girl. Another piece of cardboard to complement Eric Barner's wooden performance. And she hasn't a single line, I don't care. Moving on to the actual Janes.
The Queen, Your Grace.
Is it true what I've heard? That Robert Asker's been murdered and hung from the gates of York?
The man raised an army against me. He got what he deserved now, if you don't mind, man.
But Henry, you promised.
Oh, Jesus, not that crap again!
I hope you're happy. I went back, I watched the other half of this series in full, and my day was bad enough when I was writing this script because I had to deal with an incompetent Hermes delivery driver. But god effing damn it, this is literally the worst, isn't it? I had a full bag of Skittles when I started watching this. I'll never get those back. Jane's kind of confined to her bedroom for most of her tenure, which saves money on dresses, I suppose. Although the one dress we see her in, she's wearing a French hood. Guys, Jane didn't like French hoods. Like, I know this series has an allergic reaction to giving the main actors actual historically accurate costumes, but you couldn't have put her in one of those weird headdresses that Catherine of Aragon was wearing. The rest of her part of the episode is just focused solely on the botched recreation of the dissolution of the monasteries and the Pilgrimage of Grace. They frame the former like it's the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in reverse, and the latter is as much fun as being sober in a pub when England are playing. I wouldn't mind if Sean Bean IRL gathered tens of thousands of people and confronted the current fat lard in charge about his screwing over the country. So, Amelia Fox, she doesn't have much to do here. She says the lines and then she can go home. Because we've gotten past Anne Boleyn and we're just trying to get to Catherine Howard, so what's the point of even featuring Jane Seymour anyway? I noticed in the first half, they went all out to show off Anne and Henry's sex life, complete with a shot of Ray Winston's jiggly butt. And yet when Henry marries Jane, the most we see is them cuddling. Why is it that Anne Boleyn gets the sex scenes but Jane doesn't? Can't be because some kind of complex, can it? No, that would be too far-fetched. In this scene where Jane is convincing Henry to reconcile with Mary, I realise just how awful and claustrophobic the cinematography is. Why does the camera have to be shoved in their faces when it's a simple conversation between two people? This is a direct rip-off of this scene in Henry VIII and His Six Wives, which is much better, where it shows Jane and Henry in the same frame, and they're close enough to be intimate, but there is still an air of inequality because Jane is sat at a lower level than Henry. A picture is worth 1,000 words, but a choppy as shit scene that can't hold a shot to save its life is worth less than nothing. Oh, and this awkward scene where Jane tells Henry she's pregnant, which, by the way, happened really quickly, makes the romantic dialogue in Attack of the Clones look normal.
But it is not the plague.
It's chlamydia. You may want to get yourself checked out. Oh, but the best is yet to come. Okay, so after another Sean bites the dust, and another Sean gone, another Sean gone, another Sean bites the dust, Jane confronts Henry about breaking his promises to the people of the Pilgrimage of Grace. Henry responds by pushing the pregnant woman to the hard stone floor, belly first. And then she goes into labour, because guess what, throwing a pregnant woman to the floor doesn't elicit the best consequences. One, Jane wouldn't have been so bold as to confront Henry about his treatment of the pilgrims. She tried to speak to him candidly when the uprising started, and he warned her not to do so again, so she didn't do so again, because she wasn't as assertive as Anne Boleyn. And two, Henry wouldn't do that, especially if the wife was pregnant. Remember in this scene from Henry VIII and His Six Wives, where he was going to attack Anne in anger, but he reined himself in purely because she was pregnant. This version of Henry is so shallow that I roll my eyes every time he starts shouting. At least you tried, Ray. It's just that you were more appealing as a beaver in Narnia and slightly more tolerable as a creepy CGI cat. Though why they made you sing, I have no idea. Why did you make Ray Winston sing? Oh my god. I can't explain her death scene well enough to do it justice, so I'm going to do a thing. Where is Jane? Is she safe? Is she alright? It seems, in your anger, you killed her. No! No! She was alive! I felt it! Jane! 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 This one was disappointing. So when I started watching this film to get notes on Meryl Oberon as Anne Boleyn, I stopped just after the guns went off and Jane crossed herself. After that I expected to go back and Jane would probably be in it for at least another 20 minutes. She didn't even last 5. So much build-up for so little payoff. Jane Seymour and Catherine Howard seem to have their personalities mixed up a bit here. For Jane, she acts quite vain and childish. In this movie, Henry and Jane's wedding is scheduled to happen on the same day as Anne's execution. An excited and somewhat obtuse Jane's top priority is choosing what headdress to wear. She appeals to Henry by acting like Shirley Temple, whose career, not coincidentally, would take off later in 1933. Wendy Barry was 21 when this movie came out, so Jane herself is significantly aged down from 29 to 21, a fact she points out by pointing to the buttons on the front of her wedding dress, each one representing a year of her life. Henry reacts by laughing and, in a very unsettling act on his part, treats his new bride like a child and then roughly pulls her onto his lap and playfully bites at her neck. I don't know if this was intentionally meant to make the audience's skin crawl, or it's just that we as a society have grown to be creeped out by a fat older man pawing at a much younger woman, but it works. Jane's not cheerful for long. As once Anne has been killed, the court doesn't seem so cheerful anymore. Henry kind of reminds me of Maxim de Winter in Rebecca, in the next scene just after the execution, where he's a guy who's been married twice before and he treats it so matter-of-factly that he just grabs Jane's arm and pulls her towards the chapel as quickly as possible to get it over with, only to stop and go back into regal splendidness when they're only steps away from the altar. Sadly, this is the last we see of Jane, because then we skip forward to 1537 upon the birth of Prince Edward, and I seriously have my doubts on how that nurse is holding a newborn. Henry comes riding into the palace only to be told Jane is dead, meaning either she died during the act of childbirth or immediately afterwards from bleeding out. Not that Henry minds, he's got his son. Very unceremonious. But we'll talk about how Jane's death is portrayed and often ignored on screen in the next video.
Your Grace, I do wish to marry one day, but when I do it will not be for love.
What will you marry for in that case?
Security, honour, safety.
I see I have nothing to worry about.
I'm not going into my full thoughts on the series here because I've got a whole other video for that. We're just here to talk about Lola Pettigrew. Awesome name, by the way. She sounds like a girl at a magic school that solves mysteries with her pet cat or ferret who she called Gooseberry. As is, Lola was one of the few positive aspects of this series. The actors don't have good writing to work with, so they have to get by with their acting abilities. While Jodie Turner-Smith and Papa Essadou stride forward with the confidence that the real-life siblings had, Lola performs Jane Seymour as the compassionate but guarded lady who's afraid to show her true colours to people, which is a fair interpretation of Jane Seymour, because there is still so much about this woman we don't know. One of the things I commend this series for is taking advantage of the limited perspective to make Jane's contribution to Anne's downfall ambiguous, so we don't know if she's maliciously sabotaging Anne or if she's innocent in all this. So every time we see her on screen we're just like, what are you up to, lady? Anne overhears Jane's returning the king's letter and gets an oh shit moment as Jane gives the speech, saying she won't accept money from the king without finding a husband first. Unfortunately, that limited perspective means the series lacks any nuance and it leaves literally all the characters except Anne underdeveloped. It was so determined to build Anne as the strong female lead that it sort of forgot to remember that other characters needed fleshing out as well. Odd that this Jane is a ginge, and she's not even strawberry blonde. I know, big of me to complain that this one white lady wasn't blonde when this series was so hell-bent on casting a black actress as Anne Boleyn, but just because you cast a black Anne Boleyn does not mean you're above criticism, as my video will tell you. Again, not Jodie Turner-Smith's fault, I don't have any anger towards her.
I should have left you on that street corner where you were standing. But you didn't!
Lady Mary, Lady Anne wants you. Oh, by the saints.
Let's jump to a version where all the girls fancy Thomas Cromwell, apart from Anne Boleyn. Now this is a series that understands nuance. You don't notice Jane Seymour right away, and she's little more than a background character at court for the first few episodes, much like her real-life counterpart, who was little regarded until Henry noticed her. Jane has a humble and mouse-like demeanour, which is likely how Cromwell perceived her. It is my theory that the characters in Wolf Hall are biased through Cromwell's lens, so she is so meek and so kind, she doesn't even realise that Lady Rochford is trying to insult her. Henry starts to take a fancy to Jane at the same time as Cromwell, much to the chagrin of Mary Boleyn, who really finds thousand-yard stares attractive. The plot thread of Cromwell's crush on Jane is quickly forgotten in episode 5, when he is too busy trying to outwit Anne to stay alive. Jane is an important plot character, but the fact the series is told from one singular perspective means she doesn't have much of a part to play. It's a shame there wasn't a follow-up to this. Are we getting a follow-up? Because it would have been a great subversion to have this version of Jane suddenly gather her strength and make a public plea to Henry, which might take Cromwell by surprise. This series feels so incomplete, but I bet if we were to get another part of this series they might recast Kate Phillips because she might be too old for the role. You know what casting women is like.
Shall they stop their music?
Oh, it pleases me. Signor Chappie sends them to woo me on Lady Mary's behalf.
Could your Grace not find it in his heart to forgive her and bring her and little Elizabeth back from Hunsdon?
Jane probably has the largest segment in this movie. If not, she certainly has a hefty amount of screen time, but that's mainly because the writer of this film, Ian Thorne, also wrote the Jane Seymour episode of The Six Wives of Henry VIII, which this movie is based on. As such, a lot of these scenes are directly lifted from that episode.
I have a file of our Lord's tears. Saved me from the plague once, you know.
It comes from Hales, madam, in Gloucestershire. Your blood of Christ. Look at it. You look!
Look at it! You see nothing, do you?
You've not yet paid for absolution, but give me your coin, madam, and presto. Now you see the blood of Christ. Now you are absolved, except that it is the blood of a domestic duck, which the monks renew once a week.
Some of you wanted me to put this jewel to death.
That were great pity, sir, to have lost your chief jewel of England.
Thank God you've come, my lord.
We've urged His Grace to accept God's pleasure in taking a queen to comfort himself and a prince.
But this movie serves as a peaceful lull after the chaotic turns of Anne Boleyn's tenure, and a way to show just how disconnected Henry is while he has the monastery destroyed, and bursts into rage that a group of commoners dare tell him what to do. I'll speak more on how the Pilgrimage of Grace is depicted when we get to a rankings video on Henry VIII, so you'll have to wait. We see Jane trying to weather this storm that is her marriage, but it's not an easy experience, and it takes all she has just to keep calm. This is the ultimate form of presenting Jane as this innocent pillar of virtue to contrast Anne's seductive and coy nature. There's even a distinct contrast in how they dress, where Jane covers herself in muted colours and often kneels down in prayer on the spot, while Anne dresses in bold contrasting colours and always has something to say. Unlike the Six Wives of Henry VIII, we don't see how this pressure on Jane terrifies her, but then again, like with Wolf Hall, it is my theory that this film is told exclusively from Henry's perspective while he's on his deathbed, so he's bound to remember his third wife as this flawless ideal who could do no wrong. Jane, like the rest of the wives, disappears suddenly thanks to how short the movie is. We switch from Henry publicly taking Mary back into his good graces, then suddenly Jane is in the middle of giving birth, then she screams,
And it's gone.
Your Majesty, may I present my daughter, Lady Jane Seymour?
A day may come when Henry VIII and his 6 wives will rank above the Tudors, but it is not this day. Once again, the version with more screen time and more dimensions wins. This is the first time I'm covering someone who's been played by 2 different actors in the same thing. The reason being is that The Tudors was filmed in Ireland, and I can only imagine took a long time to film and put together. But when you're an actor with several commitments, you have to make tough choices, and you probably don't have time to stay in Ireland for several weeks while they film. Like for 4 years ongoing, which is like how, because The Tudors went on for 4 years, and that's probably why there was never a follow-up. As such, characters in The Tudors come and go between seasons purely because these actors are doing things elsewhere. It's like with Game of Thrones, which is why a lot of characters just vanished off the map, and you're just like, hey, what happened to this character? It's like, oh, the actor didn't want to be in it anymore. Okay. And I think this is why Thomas Cranmer's actor, Hans Matheson, disappeared after season 2, because even though Cranmer was a key player and should have been included in seasons 3 and 4, I think it was because he was playing Alec d'Urberville in the BBC miniseries of Test of the D'Urbervilles. Hence a lot of characters are composited together and given roles that other people would have had in real life. So this is why you have Charles Brandon doing a lot of the stuff that the Duke of Norfolk would have done. So with Jane Seymour, let's look at each actress in turn.
May I kiss you, Jane?
Aren't you the King of England?
Jane's first appearance is when Henry shows up at Wolf Hall with Brandon after a hunting trip, as opposed to visiting with the court on a summer progress. After staying there and meeting Jane, she's invited to serve Anne at court, and that's when the drama begins. There's a huge amount of tension between Anne and Jane from the start, mainly because Anne has spent most of the season paranoid about Henry's numerous affairs and is convinced Jane has been brought in as another mistress. There's not much for Jane to do, but I like this scene where Jane looks back at Henry and smiles, and revealing to the audience that she's not as naive and blameless as she looks. And later, when the Seymours are plotting, Jane is asked if she wants to be queen, to which she laughs in a way that totally reveals she does. Thankfully, this series can shoot a conversation without shoving a camera in people's faces, and pays homage to conversations held between their real-life counterparts. This conversation where Jane speaks to Henry on the Lady Mary's behalf shows the dynamic, where she appeals to him by presenting this compassionate and empathetic demeanour to not arouse Henry's anger, but also shows that she isn't assertive, as she allows Henry to divert the conversation so he can snog her in front of her family.
Women are much put upon in this world. It's my desire as much as I can to promote their interests.
I prefer this performance more, mainly because it shows that Henry and Jane's marriage wasn't the fairy tale Henry imagined it to be. From Jane's perspective, she was walking a fine line. This version also doesn't show sex scenes between Henry and Jane, but it was happy to show them between Henry and Anne, something we'll talk about in the next video. But unlike the ITV version, Jane is not confined to her bedroom, and John Rhys Meyers' incarnation stays surprisingly calm when he's around her. Because, big surprise, this show understands that Henry wasn't just a shouty bitch. But even then, there are parts that Henry is angry with her, but he doesn't raise his voice, and that can sometimes be worse than someone actually shouting at you. He threatens her not to get involved with her affairs, followed by a "don't spoil it." How haunting! This isn't a love story, this is an emotionally abusive relationship, and Jane knows it. Because it's never Henry's fault when he gets angry, I guess. Jane, like in real life, is distanced from the women around her because of her status, but carries herself quite regally as she instructs her ladies, and seems incapable of bearing a grudge. She demonstrates her compassion to Lady Elizabeth by giving away one of her necklaces so it can provide money for her young stepdaughter. I'm not sure if it's that emerald necklace that Anne Boleyn was wearing in season 1, or it was the necklace Henry gave her on her wedding day, but still, it's just like, it's a nice gesture. This is one of the few interpretations that shows the birth of Edward accurately, and by accurately I mean they don't kill her off as soon as the baby's out. Luckily they had some screen time to present how quickly things went to crap, with Henry crying at her bedside, then cutting to her wake, which accurately shows the numerous women holding vigil and Mary being the chief mourner. Henry wordlessly stands over her, and that's when the episode ends. Now that's some good filmmaking. But we're not done yet. Remember how the last two wives showed up in the final episode to give Henry their own "the reason you suck" speech? Well, Jane's got one. After saying goodbye to his family, Henry strides into a dark corridor and hears a voice.
How is my son?
Jane.
Unlike with his last two visitations, Henry is ecstatic to hear her voice and approaches her, telling her Edward will soon be king. But as you can see, Jane is not happy. Henry assures her that Edward is the most beloved of all his children, but Jane isn't there to stroke his ego anymore. She's here to tell Henry that he is a failure, and all that chopping and divorces for sons was in vain. Jane tells Henry that Edward will die young, both from his sheltered upbringing, leaving him no way to gain immunity from the diseases of the world, and the pressure Henry has put on him that will cause stress on such a small boy who will go to the grave at aged 15. Where Jane couldn't assert herself to Henry because it would endanger her life, she can now say what she wants, and lay Henry's worst fears bare. His vision of the perfect innocent wife has been shattered, and he's left weeping and understanding that the Tudor dynasty will not last. And he carries these thoughts until the very last scene of the episode.
Jane Seymour, the only one he truly loved. Wait. When my son was newly born, I died, but I'm not what I seem, or am I? Stick around and you'll suddenly see.
Given that the whole premise of the musical is a competition to determine who got the biggest load of BS from being Henry VIII's wife, you would not expect Jane Seymour to be a viable contender, and the other queens agree. Especially Anne, who had a daughter, and Henry literally chopped her head off. Just because Henry didn't treat Jane the way he treated Anne and Catherine, it doesn't mean that she had an easy ride. Her song Heart of Stone fully states that she is well aware that if she doesn't have a son, Henry will stop loving her. While she loves Henry unconditionally and considers herself having a heart of stone that will weather any storm, Henry doesn't appreciate that. If she fails, there will be another, and another. Heart of Stone is undeniably inspired by Adele's power ballads like Set Fire to the Rain and Hello, and I don't know how you could have done any better. It makes me wish that they would do a live performance of this that brought in the singers who inspired the musical, or at least have Adele cover this song and do a music video. But the song does kind of show how straining it is to be in love with someone who merely wants to use you and be caught in a state of toxic positivity. And in Jane's intro, you get struck with the tragedy Jane faced as she lay dying, knowing that she was never going to see her son grow up, when she was so excited to enjoy the little things like his first words and his first steps and not getting a good night's sleep for 3 years. As a side note, Jane wouldn't have been all that involved in Edward's upbringing because that's how court dictated it, but that line would give the mums in the audience a little stab in the heart. Not a big one, just enough to make you feel your feels. And this is just my interpretation, but I think the subject of the song discreetly changes from Henry to Edward, so that unconditional love switches from the romantic love towards a man to the devoted love of a mother. In the final song, where the queens pick an alternate future for themselves, Jane is still set on being a mother, showing that you're no less feminist for wanting to have children, and she's been able to survive childbirth with Edward and have more children. Enough to form a band with them and make terrible puns from Tudor Von Traps to Roiling Stones. We're not sure if she's still married to Henry or if she's with a husband that actually values her, but I like to think it was the latter, and if she was married to Henry, it would be a version of Henry that loved her back and treated her well. Again, it's an alternate future, you can do whatever you want with an alternate future. When I watched this the first time round, I didn't really feel it. Then I came back and boy did I feel it. If I can include a musical, I can include an opera too, right? Right? Well, I'm going to, so there. I have to ask, where has this version of Jane Seymour been all my life? I love it! This is the Jane that everyone ignores. This is the Jane I wanted to see in Anne Boleyn 2021. It also shows the tragedy and depictions of the Tudor court far better than Shakespeare did. Usually in opera, you have a main soprano and a second soprano. So if you're going to have Anne Boleyn as the main, why not have Jane Seymour be the second? And to be fair, I had no knowledge of the opera before I did my Anne Boleyn rankings, but I'll probably have to do a redux for Anne and Catherine of Aragon anyway, because either I've forgotten or there's going to be a few new ones coming up. No one can leave Anne Boleyn alone apparently. Instead of Jane, she's called Giovanna, as the opera is in Italian, but I'll still refer to them by their English names.
I'm picking it up. Sala seems to mean jerk, and I think Manjula means some kind of spaceship.
Anne sees Jane as a close friend and a confidant in this, which makes her betrayal far more painful than if they were enemies. At the start of the opera, we see the audience are aware of Jane and Henry's affair. The court knows the king is planning to replace his queen, and it's left Anne feeling paranoid and looking to Jane for relief. Anne herself is regretting her life with Henry and wishes that she'd married Henry/Ricaldo Percy instead. Jane is racked with the guilt over betraying Anne and wants to call off her relationship with Henry. Her telling him that it would only end in disgrace on her part is accurate to history, but instead of it being a conniving decision that was pushed on her by her family, she's trying to discourage Henry from getting rid of Anne and save her own reputation at the same time. But Henry will not be moved. We next see Jane as the walls are closing in around Anne. Her ladies are ushered away from her, and when Jane arrives, Anne is pleased to see her. But Jane is overwhelmed with guilt and can't meet her eye. In rage, Anne condemns the woman who will succeed her to always be haunted by her spectre, not realising that this woman will be Jane until Jane is literally on her knees begging her to stop. When she realises this, she takes back all her anger and forgives her, blaming only Henry. Jane feels she doesn't deserve forgiveness, and she'll be condemned on her part in Anne's downfall. Later, when she begs Henry for mercy on Anne's behalf, he dismisses her and calls her foolish. So much for true love. I want to talk more about this version in the next part and compare it with the 2021 version, because I've just thought of these brand new ideas, but I don't have time to put it in a script because I want this video out now. Are we sure Daphne du Maurier didn't write this episode? Because in the several times I've watched it since the box set came through my letterbox, I've just been thinking, Rebecca, Rebecca, Rebecca.
It's about this guy marries a girl, takes her back to his big old house, and all anyone can talk about is his first wife, Rebecca, who's dead.
Not that that's a bad thing. Rebecca is one of the greatest novels of all time, and the Hitchcock movie is a masterpiece. Couldn't we have had a scene where Lady Rochford tricks Jane into wearing the dress to a ball, only to find out that that was the same dress worn by Anne Boleyn? Ah, that's one for the fanfiction writers, I'm afraid, and possibly even Alison Weir. But seriously, I think this is the most perfect interpretation of Jane Seymour that we're ever going to get, and that's not an exaggeration. The episode is told through flashback, where Jane, barely clinging onto life, is brought to Edward's christening. Each scene transition is mixed with the POV camera hovering over people like Cromwell and Lady Mary. This was another thing Ian Thorne lifted to put in Henry VIII and his 6 wives. One motif you notice through repeat viewings is how Henry uses Jane as an emotional crutch. Here he's angry at Cromwell and he literally just grabs Jane to hold her close. He shouts at her over the relic, only to then be the one crying about possibly not having children. And yet, when Jane is the one in distress, Henry isn't there for her. As she gets overwhelmed during the Christmas pageantry and retreats into a quiet room, only to be told by Edward that their father is dead, she leaves the room, clearly upset. Henry catches up to her, and does he notice she's sad and asks her what's wrong? Of course not, he just kisses her because only his pleasure matters at any given time. Jane later confides in Edward that she's not happy. In fact, she's terrified because she knows she is only queen because she walked through Anne Boleyn's innocent blood to get here. She feels overwhelming guilt for what happened to her, and she feels she should be punished for it. So it's not that she willfully wanted Anne gone or didn't know what she was doing, it was more she didn't want to think of what she had done, but the imminent birth of her child has her terrified that if the child is stillborn or a girl, she'll go the same way. But if she succeeds, she'll be rewarded some more and perpetually reminded that she's only there because an innocent woman was murdered. But Jane's mind is soon set at peace as we cut to the present. Once again, Henry doesn't notice that Jane's in distress, carrying her from the chapel to her bedchamber, and I can't imagine that's very comfortable after you've just given birth. Jane passes out, and we're to presume that this is when she dies. Again, this accurately shows Mary as the chief mourner at Jane's wake, and when Henry goes to visit later, he has no emotional crutch to fall on, and he just sits there weeping, all alone. As far as Jane Seymour goes, I think we need to look deeper into her character to analyse what kind of person she was in real life. How innocent and sweet could one girl be while she had another's blood on her hands? If we depict her father and two brothers as just as scheming and opportunistic as the Boleyns, why does Jane seem like the flawless pawn in all this? Well, Anne at least got to have some cunning wit on her part. When we get to part 3, I'm mixing Jane's definitive moment and the misconceptions about her into one video. That way we can get straight on to Anna of Cleves afterwards. Another video done, eh? We're getting good at this. Alan and I are just going to move over here. We're going to have the patrons coming up this side of the screen. And a shout out to my VIP patron, Anastasia Gracia. And of course, if you want your name on this list of patrons, you can sign up on my Patreon page, link in the description. For as little as pledging £1 or $1.50, you can have your name in the credits. If you're a higher tier patron, you can get early access to scripts, and you can, as well as early access to videos, and of course the top tier patrons will be able to have a shout out in the credits, just like Anastasia here. And if you're an aspiring writer, you can get some writing advice from me, so you don't have to pay £500 for an editor. But of course, if you can't afford to pay Patreon right now, you can always like the video, leave a comment, share and subscribe, and that saves me from being eaten up by the dreaded algorithm. And I'm sorry I have to bring up the algorithm every day, but I don't have that big a channel, so it's very important that I get these things spread around as much as I can. So you will be helping the channel very much by subscribing and liking, sharing it around. And yes, next time for Jane Seymour, we're going to put her definitive moment and the misconceptions into one video, because there isn't as much to say about her as there is about Anne Boleyn, but still there is so much about Jane we don't know, and so much about Jane we get wrong, and I kind of feel that she deserves to kind of have a few of her misconceptions swept up a bit. And also I want to look at how we can make Jane better in future adaptations, so she's not just a plot point. Until then, see ya. Hopefully I'll see you again in July. I don't think I'm going to get another video out this month, so say hi to the guys, Alan. He doesn't like it when I put him in front of the camera, but he insists on sitting on my lap when I do these. I just feel it's very, very clingy. He's a very clingy kitty. In your baby. Clingy kitty. Okay, I think we'll finish there. We'll finish there. I'll see you again next time. Bye.
Henry, I hold my massive cuffs like this. Cromwell, he is pretending to hold his cuffs again, isn't he? Don't say anything. I like my head and I don't have a small neck. Rafe, what is he doing now? Man, he is weird.
You gonna give it or what?
Wearing fur isn't murder. But paying for it sure is.
Where's my money?
Huge tracts of land.
Are you going to pay me back that $40 now or what?
I don't like her portrait here or there. I don't want Anne's portrait anywhere.
I would just say take notes.
Airfed $$ stars and leave it at that.
Just don't talk to me right now. I'm very busy thinking of who to behead next.
Henry, do you think I should challenge the King of France to a wrestling match? Everyone else, remembering how badly that went on the Tudors.
Henry, my wife didn't have a boy divorce. Henry again, my wife didn't have a boy again. Beheaded. Henry again, my wife looked like a horse divorced. Henry, these all seem like reasonable explanations.
Henry, starting some shit. Everyone else stands there awkwardly.
Henry, who wants to be beheaded next? Everyone else, no, oh no, not me.
The king calls for a dance.
Henry, you lost the bet, so pay up or else. Everyone else, please pay him. You wouldn't want to lose your head.
Come on, Anne. It's been years. Can you at least let me cop a feel?
When you and your squad about to behead your second wife.
Me and the brain cells I borrowed from the void marching to my inevitable execution.
When you're with your mum, Henry, at the supermarket and she starts talking with a friend. And you're just there like,
Henry, yes, I'm married, but that lady does look rather dashing, Everyone else, our shit, here we go again.
Henry, Catherine, will you marry me? Everyone, say yes.
History nerds when a producer announces they are taking some historical liberties with their documentary.
Woman, I love you, Henry. Henry, bastards or beheading?
Me and my co-workers begrudgingly putting on clothes and going back into the office now that state COVID restrictions have lifted.
Me and the homies negotiating how much extra credit we should get on our late half-assed assignment.
One angry guy makes everyone anxious.